Good evening. People with elderly and already unwell relatives were given a worrying prediction by the Prime Minister this evening about the coronavirus. He said he had to level with the British public. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time. His advisers believe there could now be 10,000 cases out there, though the official figure is 590 with 10 deaths. It is already, the Prime Minister said, the worst public health crisis for a generation. He said anyone with symptoms, a new continuous cough or a temperature should stay at home for a week. Schools, though, should stay open. Sports events should go ahead. Shutting down those would come later when they would have the most effect. But Scotland wants to ban large gatherings now, and our nearest neighbours, the Irish Republic and France, have both announced more drastic measures, as we'll be reporting. Here, efforts to contain the disease are switching to a plan to slow its spread.
Mr Rees-Mogg, has the government got a grip on this?
What many wanted to know as ministers met to plot their next move against coronavirus.
Mr Sharp, are we going to follow Ireland's lead and close schools?
What we're going to do is absolutely follow the medical and scientific advice.
Are you going to close schools?
Shutting schools like Ireland?
The answer was no. The government thinks more limited measures remain the best remedy in an escalating health crisis. Flanked by his scientific advisers, the Prime Minister warned of the gravity of the situation.
I've got to be clear, we've all got to be clear, this is the worst public health crisis for a generation. I must level with you, level with the British public. More families, many more families, are going to lose loved ones before their time.
From tomorrow, in this new delay phase, those with a temperature or a new and persistent cough must self-isolate for 7 days. Evidence suggests you'd be infection-free by then. Schools should cancel trips abroad, and the elderly and vulnerable shouldn't go on cruises. Measures specifically not being brought in yet are closing schools, banning events such as sporting fixtures, and asking older people to self-isolate. But with up to 10,000 people possibly now infected in Britain, why the hesitation in following what other countries have done?
There may be measures that we could take which were of a very draconian and immediate nature that really did suppress drastically the contact between human beings in this country, but might mean that the disease simply came back, surged back.
As far as infection control is concerned, crowded stadiums aren't seen as high risk.
On average, one person infects 2 or 3 others. You therefore have a very low probability of infecting a large number of people in a stadium, or a rather higher probability of infecting people very close to you.
But in Scotland, events are being cancelled, apparently to relieve pressure on the emergency services.
We will, from the start of next week, advise the cancellation of mass gatherings of over 500 people that have the potential to have an impact on our frontline emergency services.
Meanwhile, Labour says the government needs to explain itself better.
I want the government to offer greater clarity. The British public are hearing about what's happening in Ireland, what's happening in Norway, what's happening in France, and they're asking legitimate questions about why are we not doing the same. Now, I agree we should always be following the science, but to maintain public confidence in the government's approach, they've got to be fully transparent.
The former Health Secretary is also uneasy about the plan.
The countries that seem to have been successful acted early, particularly on social distancing. And I think one of the things that will concern people is that we're not acting sooner.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
The Prime Minister's light touch approach may change, he says, but for now it's a gamble he thinks will pay off. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
So now we know the government thinks there may already be up to 10,000 coronavirus cases in the UK, but the official confirmed number has risen by 134 to 590 tonight. And there have been 2 more deaths confirmed, taking the total to 10. Cases in Scotland have risen by 24 to 60, and as we heard there in Libby's piece, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has put herself at odds with the Prime Minister on dealing with the virus. She says the time is right to ban gatherings of over 500 people. Let's cross to our Scotland correspondent Peter Smith in Glasgow. So why is Nicola Sturgeon taking a different approach then, Peter?
Well, she has taken Scotland on a different path from the rest of the UK in dealing with this coronavirus outbreak, and she said it's simply a matter of prioritising accident and emergency resources. She doesn't want them deployed at things like football matches, sports events, music concerts, when all hands will be needed to deal with this coronavirus outbreak. And she's preparing Scotland, what she says, for a spike in the weeks and months ahead. And to put it into context, I've just had some statistics from the Scottish Government tonight saying that in the whole of Scotland we have 190 intensive care unit beds with ventilators. 70% of them are already being used. That means that there are about 60 ICU beds with ventilators available now to deal with Scotland preparing for the brunt of a global pandemic. Now, the Scottish Government says it wants to double the number of ICU beds with ventilators. It's also preparing to move into a phase of cancelling surgery. But clearly, there are many people who would be concerned, and this is about the Scottish Government taking action now to prioritise those accident and emergency resources.
OK, Peter, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, the Irish Republic has gone even further than Scotland is planning. Their Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, has also ordered an end to large gatherings and the closure of schools, colleges and nurseries for 2 weeks. He said this action was following European scientific advice.
Ireland has now had 70 confirmed cases of coronavirus, but despite the fairly low number, the government here is taking pretty drastic action. On an official visit to Washington, the Taoiseach announced the closure of all schools and other institutions would start from 6 p.m.
We've not witnessed a pandemic of this nature in living memory, and this is uncharted territory for us. We said we would take the right actions at the right time, and we have to move now to have the greatest impact.
The closures will remain in force for at least 2 weeks, with teachers encouraged to send work home. Despite the disruption, parents in County Louth today were supportive.
A lot of people saying it should have been done sooner, etc. I think it's the right decision to make now, and we are in a situation that this is escalating.
Doesn't it create childcare problems for you?
Luckily for me, no.
Or for me.
Yeah.
So if it's protecting the old and the vulnerable, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think it's good, but I don't know. My son and daughter-in-law is going to think it's good because they both work.
Yeah.
And these are their 2 children.
So the Irish government has closed all schools, colleges, nurseries and cultural institutions from tonight until the 29th of March at least. It wants mass gatherings of more than 100 people indoors or more than 500 outdoors to be cancelled. Shops, restaurants and public transport do remain open, but must take precautions. Here along the Irish border, children from either side can and do cross over to the other to go to school. But tomorrow morning, schools here on the British side will be open, whereas the schools on the Irish side will be closed. And what no one can yet be certain of is which approach will prove more effective. Ireland has never attempted anything quite like this before. Very few places have. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, County Louth.
Well, mirroring Ireland's approach, France's President Macron went on television this evening to announce the closure of schools, universities and nurseries there from Monday until further notice. Well, Stacey Foster is in Paris for us tonight. What did President Macron have to say, Stacey?
Well, this was the first time the President had addressed the nation on the subject of coronavirus, and he said that this was the most serious health crisis that France has faced in a century. He said there are a number of cases here now, nearly 3,061 people have died, and so from Monday France would take that drastic measure of closing all schools, colleges, universities and nurseries, affecting some 12 million children and students and of course their families, to help stop the spread of this virus. There was some reassurance though that the local elections would continue as planned this weekend. He said that was important, and also that public transport would continue to operate as normal. But there is a real fear here that the number of cases continues to rise on a similar trajectory to that of Italy. And so the measures we're seeing here now could be felt in the UK over the coming weeks. France just a couple of weeks behind Italy in terms of the spread of this virus. And while President Macron has said he does not want to close borders, that would be a decision made with his European colleagues. There is a feeling here tonight that he would be prepared to take that decision himself if it meant stopping the spread of coronavirus.
Stacey, thank you for that. So, as we were just hearing from Stacey and before from the Irish Republic, our European neighbours have decided the time is right to start closing things down. Here, though, the decision is to delay such measures for a while at least. So what factors are at play here? Is it the advice, or is it that the UK is further behind in the virus's spread?
Coronavirus is in our midst. Thousands of us could have it already, too many now for it to be contained. So we must stay at home for a week if we get ill and avoid contact. But should the government be doing more, and have they done enough since the outbreak began?
From day one, the government's approach has been complacent. It's been over-dependent on specialists and medical opinion. It's appreciated the importance of taking the public with you and of being totally open, honest and transparent.
It's perhaps why many are questioning why the UK isn't taking more drastic measures. In Denmark, schools, libraries and leisure facilities are shut and most public servants have been ordered to stay at home. Schools are also closed in Spain and football matches suspended. Norway's another country where schools and universities are shut, and the government's told workers to stay a metre away from one another. Italy's popular landmarks are eerily quiet as its lockdown has driven residents indoors and tourists home.
Life appears to be continuing as normal here. Hundreds of people are still milling around in central London, but the UK is increasingly looking alone in Europe. Will this square be empty in 2 weeks' time, and should it, like Italy, be empty now?
Not necessarily, says the World Health Organization, which has pleaded for aggressive action.
We want to see every community slow down the transmission of this virus. If you look at Singapore, for instance, they have not had to go into lockdown. They have been able to slow down their virus. Now they do it their way, you will do it your way.
Unlike other countries, the government says schools will remain open here. Although constantly under review, many argue mass closures could cause more harm than good.
Closing schools in itself has problems. It could decimate the health and social care workforce as parents take off time to look after their children. Secondly, it could end up who looks after children? Oh look, the grandparents come along and they're far more at risk.
In these unpredictable times, there's no doubt the government wants us to trust their advice. But as much of Europe ramps up its response, it may be only a matter of time before we too are forced to follow in their footsteps. Emily Morgan, News at 10.
Well, two of our expert editors were at the Prime Minister's virus briefing this evening. Our science editor, Tom Clark, and our political editor, Robert Peston. Good to see you both. This was a sombre and sobering event, this briefing. Tom, to you first. What did you make of the science and the way it's being communicated?
I think they made it abundantly clear that we are entering a new phase of this outbreak and a new phase of how the government plans to deal with it. I think one of the things that came across really well and very clearly is how dependent the government strategy is on the 80% of us who aren't going to get gravely ill because of this virus. Depending on how those 80%, the majority, react, that's what dictates the difference between this becoming an unmanageable outbreak and one that the NHS can stay on top of. If we having a bad cough or worried that we've got coronavirus, call 111, head to A&E, go to the doctor, we could choke up the symptoms, choke up the system, we could spread the virus around to those most vulnerable people and put that pressure on the NHS. So they made that clear. But I think what also emerged, graphs were put up, for example, but there were no numbers on them. The scientists themselves are in uncharted territory here. When that peak's going to hit, how big that peak is going to be, we just don't know. They are taking some risks here about when we close schools, when we do things, but they think they're making the right decisions, and there is a lot of scientific evidence to support that right now. we'll just wait and see how it plays out.
I mean, it is interesting, Robert, isn't it? Whenever you hear any of the government ministers speak, Prime Minister included, of course, they always say, we are being guided by the science. But there is political judgment to be made within this. And people are looking to their political leaders for a steer and whether they really feel they can have faith in it.
So, look, it is a political judgment to say we're just doing what the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor tell us to do. And, you know, let's be clear, the Chief Medical Officer in particular has a very strong view that this virus has to run its course. He repeatedly points out that we have no immunity to it. He also points out that the mortality rate, although if it affected a large section of the population, vast numbers of people we love would die, as a percentage, it's low. And so he is making the judgment that we have to delay the peak to a period when the NHS is better able to cope, although nobody's able to give us assurance that even if it's delayed, the NHS will really have the resources. And people are looking to the rest of the world and asking, why is it that in France, which has only got a few more infections than us, they're closing universities already? Why is it in Ireland they're taking similar actions? What is it that we know that they don't know? It is a bold political judgment that, in the end, Boris Johnson is making to do things so differently from the consensus elsewhere.
And also, should be stated, uncharted territory in both parties. It has to be said at this stage. OK, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your take on what we heard at that briefing today. Well, in a national health crisis, it's cool heads that are needed. In the United States, President Trump is under fire for his typically unpredictable behaviour, some would argue, with lives clearly at stake in America as elsewhere. The president is being accused of at first underestimating the effects of the virus and now overreacting with a ban on travel from the European Union. He says he's not worried. He's caught it himself after a Brazilian official he met in Florida last week tested positive.
Thank you all very much. It's an honour to be with the Prime Minister of Ireland.
As the President met Leo Varadkar, he was confronting the harsh reality that his speech last night had spectacularly failed to calm the markets or the American people. His primetime address to the nation appeared to blame Europe, and he made his decision without consulting any EU leaders.
The European Union failed to take the same precautions and restrict travel from China and other hotspots. As a result, a large number of new clusters in the United States were seeded by travelers from Europe. To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. The new rules will go into effect Friday at midnight. This is the most aggressive and comprehensive effort to confront a foreign virus in modern history.
That peculiar description of the pathogen as a foreign virus prompted his likely Democratic rival for the White House to accuse the president of sowing division with a series of missteps.
Downplaying it, being overly dismissive, or spreading misinformation is only going to hurt us and further advantage the spread of the disease. But neither should we panic or fall back on xenophobia. Labeling COVID-19 a foreign virus.
For reasons that remain unclear, that flight ban does not apply to the UK or Ireland. But the presidential proclamation is already causing disruption for airline passengers all across Europe. It has also emerged that a Brazilian official, here on the right, who has been in close and recent proximity to the president, has tested positive for the virus. But today, Donald Trump dismissed concerns for his own health.
We did nothing very unusual. We sat next to each other for a period of time, had a great conversation. Let's put it this way, I'm not concerned.
But in Canada, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has gone into self-isolation after his wife showed symptoms of coronavirus. The couple have just returned from a trip to London. With the virus already here and spreading rapidly, the value of that flight ban from Europe appears marginal. And now criticism of America's preparations for the pandemic are growing by the hour. The erratic performance of the president is under increasingly harsh scrutiny. His skepticism of science, his promotion of conspiracy theories, now undermining any attempt to build confidence in his leadership. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Well, President Trump's travel ban did nothing to calm the fear of jittery stock markets in America and around the world. Here, the FTSE at 5,237 points was down yet another 10%, almost 11, the biggest one-day fall for 30 years. In the United States, trading again had to be suspended this morning because of the steepness of the fall. This evening, it stood at 21,200, down 9.9%. And the DAX in Frankfurt ended down 9,161, a fall of more than 12%.
It has been another extraordinary day. Stock markets opened in a state of high anxiety, which gave way to panic. Investors are in the dark. They don't know how many people will fall ill or how long it will take for them to recover. An economic shock of unknowable scale is upon us, and shares in companies are being sold off. The FTSE 100 closed down more than 10%, the second largest fall in its history.
When was the last time you saw falls like this? It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, even in 2008, we didn't see falls like that.
No, these are bigger. This is bigger than 2008. Yeah, this is serious. It's got. There's risks now when we see the breakdown in the way some of the financial markets are actually working now. We're actually starting to see a breakdown in the sort of plumbing, the sort of stuff that happens to make things work smoothly, to make markets function smoothly. We're starting to see that breakdown, and that's the real worry.
This was not a flight to safety, it was an exodus. When Wall Street opened, share prices headed south and trading was almost immediately suspended. 15 The Federal Reserve, the US central bank, announced plans to make $1 trillion of short-term loans available. Stock market slumps may feel remote and irrelevant, but they have very real consequences. They kick holes in people's pension savings, and they make it impossible for companies to raise money by issuing shares. And the concern here is that some companies are running out of money and will fail in the months ahead. Today, Into, which owns a host of shopping centres around the UK, warned it may go bust. Cineworld said in a worst-case scenario, the coronavirus outbreak may leave it unable to pay its debts. The Carnival Group decided to suspend its Princess Cruises operation. 18 ships will be confined to port. And Norwegian Air cancelled flights and routes and said it intends to lay off half of its 11,000 staff. It hopes the move is temporary. The airline industry is in crisis and says it needs government help.
We already saw an airline go under in the UK, and it's possible others may follow. This is a very, very serious situation for the industry. It's not just the Schengen to US market. We're obviously seeing a collapse in air traffic across the board.
Tonight, the final bell on Wall Street. The applause and the smiles were misplaced. This was one of the worst one-day falls in history, and there may be more to come. Joel Hills, News at 10.
So that was the story of the markets then, but one of the most difficult struggles to limit the effects of the virus is already being played out too in the homes of elderly and disabled people, the length and breadth of the UK. Many rely on care workers coming in and out to look after them. ITV News understands the government will issue guidance to care workers tomorrow. Those on the coronavirus front line say they need emergency funding and help from the government.
How long does it say until we get there?
It is their job to look after the vulnerable, but right now it takes extra care.
Good morning, Mary. How are you?
At each door, there's the risk it's not just the carers calling. Hands are washed every time they enter.
Okay, I'm just going to make your bed for you, OK?
The people they visit are often alone, but coronavirus could mean enforced isolation.
Well, I think it's a worry to everybody, isn't it? I'd probably be depressed if you didn't get anybody.
Because you rely on these people?
Yeah, you do rely on these people.
How would you feel if you accidentally brought coronavirus into a home like this?
Oh, awful. You know, that's something that we don't want to happen, and that's something that we are trying to prevent by making everybody aware of wearing your PPE, your hand washing.
Especially when others on their rounds already have health problems.
Good morning.
It is a worry for me because I've got an autoimmune system problem anyway. So any cold or cough, it affects me badly. I don't go out myself now.
There are other concerns at the care company's headquarters.
But as you can see here...
2 bottles of hand sanitizer.
That's right.
Their usual suppliers are all out.
Where are you having to find this stock now?
eBay, Amazon, we've been going around actual shops.
And then there's the emergency equipment.
So we're talking about respirators, full body hazmat suits.
One member of staff here has already had to self-isolate. The manager predicts a care crisis if the government doesn't act.
We keep sort of getting pushed aside and forgotten, the sector's got 100,000 vacancies, so something like this crisis is really now showing that up.
ITV News understands the government will give care providers new guidance tomorrow.
Thank you, see you later.
But as the virus spreads, not everyone is safer shut off from the outside. Paul Brand, News at 10, Hertfordshire.
Well, a whole host of sporting fixtures are falling victim to the spread of the virus. In the last few minutes, it's just emerged that Arsenal's manager Mikel Arteta has tested positive. Manchester City's Champions League match against Real Madrid next week has been postponed. Some international tennis matches are off, and there's a chance the Australian Grand Prix could go the same way. Lewis Hamilton certainly thinks that it should.
An empty stadium for Manchester United tonight, but at least their game in Austria is on. Elsewhere across the world, more and more sport is not.
Players are going back to the locker room.
The multi-billion-pound NBA in America and the Men's World Tennis Tour, the latest to be suspended. Last night, Liverpool boss Jurgen Klopp even admonished fans for trying to shake his hand, and now one fellow Premier League manager has called for English football to be halted too.
For me, a delay, an extension to the season would be my preferred option.
The opening Formula One race in Melbourne is also expected to be called off. A British mechanic working for McLaren tested positive, and his team have already pulled out. While 6 times world champion Lewis Hamilton is adamant there should be no racing at all in Australia.
I am really very, very surprised that we're here. I think motorsport is great that we have races, but for me it's shocking that we're all sitting in this room.
There are also plenty who think that the Cheltenham Festival should not be taking place. And while Ireland has announced racing there will be behind closed doors from Friday, 60,000 plus will be here in Gloucestershire tomorrow for the Gold Cup.
The advice today coming out following the Cobra meeting is no different to what we've received before, and they fully expect us to complete the festival.
In Athens, the Olympic torch was lit, usually a moment of huge anticipation, but spectators were banned. Only world wars have stopped the Games in modern times. The flame is heading for Japan, even though athletes may yet not. Richard Pallow, News at 10.
When the Queen wore gloves for an investiture ceremony last week, the palace stayed quiet about whether it was a defence against the virus. So what would Prince Charles do then when it was his turn today? Well, he decided to adopt the Indian greeting, the Namaste, rather than shake hands when he presented awards, including to the former Play School presenter Floella Benjamin for her charity work. And there is more information on the coronavirus outbreak on our website. It includes a map of confirmed cases around the country. And there are also details of the new government advice and the symptoms to look out for. That's itv.com/news. In other news now, the British soldier who was killed in Iraq yesterday by a missile attack was named today by the Ministry of Defence and remembered by her colleagues. She was Lance Corporal Brodie Gillen, an army medic, a reservist with the Scottish and North Irish Yeomanry. She was 26. And Michel Roux, one of the chefs who changed not just the food we eat, but the places we eat it in, has died. He was 79 and had a long-standing lung problem. He was a legendary cook, of course, and with his brother Albert, a Michelin-starred restaurateur. Back to the coronavirus crisis now and what tomorrow's newspaper front pages make of such a dramatic day. The Telegraph shows the Prime Minister with the Chief Medical Officer for England, Professor Chris Whitty, and quotes Mr Johnson's warning that many more families are going to lose loved ones. The Mail has the same quotation taken from what the paper calls a very sombre news conference. The Independent reports that figure from this evening's news conference that there could be 10,000 cases of the virus out there. It says the Prime Minister is resisting calls to close schools and postpone sports events. And as the number of coronavirus cases has grown, it was only a matter of time then before the Prime Minister gave the country the kind of warning he issued this evening.
I must level with you, level with the British public. More families, many more families, are going to lose loved ones before their time. I've got to be clear, we've all got to be clear, this is the worst public health crisis for a generation.
So now we have been put on notice that normal life, like for these people tonight, will have to change to limit the spread and try to limit the number of the deaths the Prime Minister talked about. The full consequences of the virus remain hard to fathom, but our everyday existence, wherever we live it, may be very different for many weeks to come. We'll have more coverage, of course, throughout all of tomorrow. That is it from News at 10 for tonight. From all of us, good night.